Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into one of the most fundamental questions in all of organization theory. How exactly do organizations relate to the world around them? It sounds simple, right? But this one question has sparked decades of intense debate, leading to some profoundly different ways of seeing the entire business landscape. We're going to trace that whole intellectual journey, right from the moment we first considered the environment as a concrete reality to the idea that it might just be a product of our own minds.
And this right here is the central tension. This is the core debate that's been driving the field for years. Do you see an organization as this autonomous entity confidently charting its own course through the world? Or is it something more reactive, a product that's constantly being shaped and buffeted by powerful forces in its environment? This single question, as we'll see, unlocks a whole universe of competing and fascinating ideas.
So our journey today will move through four major perspectives. We'll start with that initial moment when theorists first decided to look outside the box. Then we'll explore how they tried to map the environment as an objective, measurable reality. After that, we'll challenge that very idea, asking if the environment is actually something we construct ourselves. And finally, we'll deconstruct all of these views to see the environment as a field of power. All right, let's dive in.
Our story really begins back in the 1950s. You have to remember, before this, management theory was almost entirely focused inward, on things like internal operations, time and motion studies, and efficiency. But a revolutionary shift in thinking was just on the horizon, as theorists finally began to look beyond the factory walls.
And this was the foundational idea that started it all, the open systems model. It's a simple concept, but it was incredibly powerful. For the first time, an organization wasn't seen as a closed box. Instead, it was a process. It draws in inputs, things like raw materials, capital, people, from the environment, transforms them, and then releases outputs, like goods and services, back into that same environment. This simple diagram established the environment as a tangible, external entity.
Now, this initial concept very quickly evolved into what we now call the modernist perspective. From this viewpoint, the environment isn't just a passive place you get resources from. No, it's an objective external reality. It's a set of measurable forces and real conditions that a smart organization absolutely must diagnose correctly and adapt to if it wants to survive.
A cornerstone of this modernist view is contingency theory, and its core idea is that there is no single best way to run a company. It all depends. It's contingent on the environment. So think about a car factory in a very stable, predictable market. It can thrive with a rigid, efficient, almost machine-like structure, what we call mechanistic. But now, picture a tech startup in a chaotic, fast-changing industry. It needs to be flexible, adaptable, organic, just to keep its head above water. The environment, this theory argues, is what dictates the optimal form. Okay, so if the environment dictates your structure, what happens when you need something from that environment? This is where resource dependence theory comes in, adding a crucial layer of strategy. It argues that survival isn't just about adaptation, it's about power. If your company relies on a single supplier for a vital component, who really has the upper hand in that relationship? The whole game from this perspective is about understanding and managing these dependencies to try and reclaim as much control as you can. Then we have population ecology, which zooms way out to take a more Darwinian big-picture view. It's less concerned with how one manager in one firm adapts and more with the entire population of similar organizations. Here, the environment is seen as an ecological niche that literally selects the fittest organizations to survive. New companies provide variation, the market selects the winners, and those successful forms are retained and copied, shaping the entire industry over time.
And this list really grounds that idea of an objective environment in reality. These are the concrete actors that make up the organization's network. They're the sources of critical resources, they're the agents of competitive pressure, and they are, ultimately, the ones who determine success or failure. For a modernist manager, your job is to map this network and navigate it.
But here's the plot twist. The whole idea of a single objective environment started to show some serious cracks. Researchers were finding that managers in the exact same industry, facing what should have been the exact same market conditions, would describe their environment in completely different ways. Some saw stability and opportunity, others saw chaos and threat. And that suggested that perception might be playing a much bigger role than anyone had realized.
And that fascinating finding opens the door to a profoundly different way of thinking, the symbolic perspective.
This view makes a radical claim. It proposes that the environment isn't some objective reality out there just waiting to be discovered. Instead, it's a social construction, something we bring into being through our shared beliefs, our common language, and our collective interpretations.
Now, a central part of this is institutional theory. And what's so interesting here is the shift in focus. It suggests that organizations aren't just competing for money and customers, they're competing for something much more intangible: social legitimacy. To survive, you have to conform to the accepted rules and norms of your field so that you're seen as appropriate and, well, legitimate. That legitimacy is itself a critical resource.
So how does everyone end up conforming? It happens through three key pressures. First, there's coercive pressure. That's the force of law and regulation. You just have to do it. Then you have normative pressure, which comes from professional standards and cultural expectations. It's what it means to be a proper hospital or a real university. And finally, there's mimetic pressure. This happens when you're uncertain, so you just copy what successful organizations are doing. Together, these forces explain why so many organizations in the same field end up looking remarkably similar.
And this process leads to the powerful concept of institutional myths. These are widely held beliefs that everyone just accepts as true, but they aren't really based on objective performance. The idea that certain banks were too big to fail during the 2008 financial crisis, that's a perfect example. That myth granted them a kind of legitimacy and access to support that was completely separate from how well they were actually performing.
Enactment theory takes this idea a step further into even more radical territory. It suggests that managers don't just react to an environment, they literally create it through their actions and interpretations. Think about it. By choosing what bits of information to pay attention to, how to make sense of them, and then acting on that interpretation, they enact a specific reality for their organization. The environment isn't some pre-existing thing, it's an outcome of the very process of organizing.
Our final stop on this journey is the postmodern critique. And this perspective takes a fundamentally different approach. It doesn't just offer another model of the environment. Instead, it questions the very assumptions of the previous two. It asks, who benefits from seeing the world as an objective reality, and whose interests are being served when we accept a particular social construction as normal? This lens forces us to hunt for the hidden dynamics of power.
Now, to really grasp this critique, we have to quickly look at how we got here. Postmodernists argue that the modern organization didn't just pop into existence. It evolved through these distinct phases of industrialization. And each phase didn't just change how we work, it created new and often more subtle systems of power and control. This history is the essential backdrop for understanding the post-industrial world we live in now.
And this table just lays out the contrast so clearly. Just look at the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial period. The environment goes from national to global. Technology goes from routine to innovative. And structure, it moves from stable, predictable hierarchies to these fluid, sometimes chaotic, networks. This wasn't just a tweak to the org chart, it was a fundamental change in the entire logic of how we organize ourselves.
Now, emerging from this new, complex context is stakeholder theory. It directly challenges that classic idea that a corporation's only real duty is to its shareholders. Instead, it argues for a kind of corporate social contract, an ethical obligation to all stakeholders. We're talking employees, customers, local communities, suppliers, even the natural environment. It fundamentally politicizes and moralizes the entire relationship between an organization and its world.
So the real core of the postmodern critique is this. It attacks what it calls grand narratives. Big, sweeping stories about things like efficiency or rationality, and reveals them as forms of hegemony. Hegemony is a tricky but powerful concept. It's when the interests of one dominant group are disguised as just common sense, as the natural way things are. By deconstructing the language and the stories we tell, postmodernists try to expose these hidden power structures.
So where does that leave us after this journey through so many competing and sometimes contradictory theories? Well, the most useful approach isn't to pick one and say, this is the right one. It's to see all of them as a complementary toolkit for analysis.
And this really is the key takeaway. We have three distinct lenses we can use. The modernist lens helps us analyze the objective realities, the resources, the competition, the hard constraints. The symbolic lens forces us to consider how perception, culture, and the hunt for legitimacy are shaping what's happening. And finally, the postmodern lens demands that we always ask critical questions about power and ethics.
And that leaves us with a final, and I think crucial question to ponder. When you look at any organization, which of these lenses seems to reveal the most interesting things? And perhaps more importantly, always ask yourself, whose interest does that particular lens serve? Because as we've seen today, the way we choose to see the world is never, ever a neutral act. Thank you for joining us.